The night Corinne Aldridge walked into the Fairmont Ballroom on the arm of Hartwell Investments' most powerful partner, her ex-husband was standing 40 feet away with a glass of champagne in one hand and his girlfriend's waist in the other. He didn't see her at first. That was the thing she would remember most. Not the chandelier light catching the sequins on her dress. Not the way the room seemed to hold its breath when she and Graham Whitfield entered together. Not even the moment when the sound of her name being announced made every head turn. What she would remember was the exact second Brendan Marsh looked up from whatever amusing thing Tanya was whispering in his ear and found Corinne standing there. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. She had imagined this moment, in the small hours of too many sleepless nights. She had imagined feeling triumph, or maybe some version of vindictive satisfaction. What she actually felt, in that breath between recognition and consequence, was simply calm. The kind of calm that only comes after you've survived the worst of something and come out the other side. 14 months earlier, Corinne had stood in the kitchen of the house she and Brendan had built together. Not metaphorically, literally built. She had picked the backsplash tiles herself, had argued with the contractor about the ceiling height for 3 weeks, and listened to her husband tell her he wasn't in love with her anymore. He had said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing, carefully, without looking directly at her. She remembered noticing the coffee maker dripping in the background. She remembered the sound it made. She remembered thinking, absurdly, that she'd forgotten to descale it, and now she probably never would. "How long?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Brendan finally looked at her. "Corinne, how long, Brendan?" He set down his keys. He'd come home early, which should have told her something, and ran his hand over the back of his neck. 8 months. 8 months. She had been managing the Edmonton expansion of his firm for 8 months. She had been flying back and forth between cities, missing dinners and weekends, and her best friend's birthday, working 14-hour days so that Marsh Capital could plant its flag in a new market. She had built him a foothold in a city where no one knew his name, and she had done it in 8 months. And apparently in that same 8 months he had been sleeping with Tanya Fielding, who was 29 and worked in brand communications, and had never once been asked to descale a coffee maker for anyone. She didn't cry, not in front of him. That surprised them both. What she said, after a silence that lasted long enough that the coffee maker finally stopped dripping, was, "I want to see a lawyer by the end of the week." Brendan blinked. He had expected something else. Tears, maybe, or the kind of argument that ends with someone sleeping on a couch. He had not expected her voice to sound like that, flat, already somewhere else. "Corinne, we should talk about this. We've talked," she said. "You talked for 8 months without saying a word to me. I think the conversation is over." She took her coffee from the counter. She'd made it 10 minutes ago and hadn't touched it. It was cold. And she walked to the bedroom, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of the bed in their room with the duvet she had ordered from a shop in Montreal and the framed print above the headboard that she'd found at a market in Kensington. And she held the cold coffee cup in both hands and breathed. Then she called her sister. The divorce took 4 months, which her lawyer, a composed woman named Veronique Chartron, who wore her gray hair short and said exactly what she meant, told her was relatively fast. "It helps that you were meticulous," Veronique said, at one of their early meetings, sliding a folder back across the table. "You kept records." Corinne had kept records, not because she'd suspected anything. She hadn't, and that particular realization had its own specific kind of pain to work through later, but because she had always been the organized one, the one who filed things and dated things and kept copies. It was one of the things Brendan used to say he admired about her early on, before admiration had curdled into something that looked more like inconvenience. The records mattered for a different reason than she had anticipated. Because what Veronique found, once she started looking, was that the Edmonton expansion, the one Corinne had designed and executed and pushed through entirely on the back of her own contacts and credibility, had been structured in a way that quietly cut her out of the equity she had been verbally promised. Verbally, not in writing. Because Brendan had suggested 18 months ago that it felt strange to put everything in a contract when they were married, and she had agreed because she had trusted him, and because she had been working 60 hours a week and hadn't had the bandwidth to push back on something that seemed, at the time, like a formality. Veronique had looked at her over the folder and said, "I want you to understand what you built." Corinne understood. She had understood for a while. She just hadn't known that understanding something and being compensated for it were going to require a fight. The settlement was not what she deserved. It was what she could prove. There was a difference, and she was aware of it every single day, and she took what she could prove and she signed the papers and she got out. She rented a one-bedroom apartment in Westmount. It was smaller than every room in the house she'd left. She bought a plant. She descaled the coffee maker on the first Sunday she was there, alone with a podcast playing and the November light coming gray through the window. And she cried then, finally fully, the way she hadn't been able to in front of him. And then she made herself a proper breakfast and ate it standing at the kitchen counter and decided she was going to be fine. She was not fine yet, but she had decided it, and with Corinne Aldridge, deciding something was most of the work. She met Graham Whitfield through her colleague, Priya, who had been trying to get her out of the apartment and back into professional circulation since December. "Come to the Meridian Group dinner," Priya said, for what Corinne counted as the fourth time in 2 weeks. "It's not a setup. It's networking. You are a person who networks." "I used to be a person who networked," Corinne said. "I am now a person who eats soup and watches documentary. Come to the dinner." She went to the dinner. Graham Whitfield was there because Hartwell Investments had partnered with Meridian on a development project that was, according to everyone in the room, either the most ambitious commercial real estate play in the Montreal market in 20 years or an extremely expensive mistake, depending on who you asked. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, tall, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been the most important person in enough rooms that he no longer needed to perform it. He had been talking to a pair of architects when Priya introduced them, and he had turned to Corinne with the particular attention of someone who actually listened and said, "Aldridge, you ran the Marsh Capital Edmonton build-out?" She hadn't expected that. "I did. I heard it was done in 8 months. It was, the projections I saw had it. At 14, not unkindly, more like someone recalibrating." "How?" she told him. She hadn't talked about it much since the divorce. It felt like touching something bruised, but Graham asked the right questions, the specific kind that only people who actually understood the work would know to ask. And before she noticed what was happening, she was explaining the structure she'd built, and the relationships she'd leveraged, and the particular problem she'd solved. With the zoning variance that had been blocking the whole project for 6 weeks. And he was listening in a way that made her feel, for the first time in months, like herself. After the dinner, he gave her his card and said, "I'd like to continue this conversation." She thought it was a pleasantry. It wasn't. He called her the following Tuesday and offered her a consulting contract. And then, 3 months after that, a senior advisory role at Hartwell, with equity structured in writing not this time, in a contract that Veronique reviewed and approved with what Corinne had come to recognize as her version of enthusiasm, which was a small, precise nod. "This is fair," Veronique said. "This is actually fair." Corinne signed it. She didn't think about Brendan much. As winter moved into spring and her work expanded, she thought about him the way you think about a scar, aware of it, occasionally, when the light hit a certain way but no longer in any particular pain. She knew, through the overlapping social circles that Montreal made inevitable, that he and Tanya were still together. She knew that Tanya had moved into the Westmount house. Her house. She still thought of it that way, which she was working on, and that Brendan had started making appearances at the kind of events he had never cared about when they were married. She did not know, until Priya texted her a screenshot in early September, that Marsh Capital had been nominated for the Lumiere Business Excellence Award in the commercial development category, the category that Corinne had built. She stared at the screenshot for a long time. Then she called Veronique. The Lumiere Gala was held every year at the Fairmont Queen Elizabeth. It was the kind of event that mattered in Montreal. The kind where the right people were in the same room and things happened. Decisions got made, relationships calcified into commitments. Corinne had attended twice during her marriage, both times as Brendan's wife, standing slightly behind him, while he worked the room. Graham had invited her as his guest this year, professional. He was collecting a Lifetime Achievement Award and had asked 3 of his senior people to attend with. She had almost declined, until she found out about the nomination. She told Graham about it, over coffee, 2 weeks before the gala. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have documentation of your role in the Edmonton project?" "I do." He looked at her steadily. "All of it?" "I kept records," she said. "I always keep records." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. "Then I think you should be in the room," he said. She wore the black dress. She'd bought it on a whim in February, during the brief, slightly unhinged phase of her recovery where she'd spent 3 weekends going to art galleries alone and eating at restaurant bars and buying things she didn't have an occasion for yet. The dress was silk, fitted, with a neckline that was more confident than she felt when she bought it. She felt exactly right in it now. The car pulled up to the Fairmont and Graham offered his hand as she stepped out. And she took it, and they walked in together. The ballroom was already full. The chandeliers were doing what chandeliers at the Fairmont always did, which was remind everyone in the room that they were in a place where things happen. Tables were arranged in a loose arc around a low stage, and the noise was the particular layered sound of 200 people networking at once. Not loud, exactly, just dense. She saw Brendan before he saw her. He was at a table near the center of the room, standing with a drink in his hand. And Tanya was beside him in a silver dress, and he was laughing at something, relaxed in the way that people are relaxed when they feel completely secure, when they believe the room belongs to them. Corinne felt nothing that surprised her. Then someone said her name. Not Brendan, someone from the awards committee, someone she'd met at the Meridian dinner, and she turned toward the sound, and in her peripheral vision she saw Brendan's laugh stop. She did not look at him. She smiled at the woman from the committee, whose name was Lorraine Mackey. She'd appeared in one of the documents Veronique had been working through, actually. Corinne had a good memory for names and said, "Of course, how are you?" The awards portion of the evening began at 8:30. The Lumiere committee ran through the categories in the usual order, and when they reached commercial development, Corinne was seated at Graham's table with a glass of water in front of her, and she was very still. The presenter opened the envelope. "The award for excellence in commercial development goes to Marsh Capital for the Edmonton Meridian Gateway project." Applause. The kind that starts in one part of the room and travels. Brendan stood. He straightened his jacket. He made his way to the stage with the particular walk of a man who had spent a year and a half preparing to deserve exactly this, and Corinne watched him take the award from the presenter's hands and step to the microphone, and she waited. "This project was a team effort," Brendan said. He had a good voice for rooms like this. Warm. Convincing. "I'm proud of what Marsh Capital accomplished in Edmonton, and I want to thank everyone who made it possible." He kept talking. He named 4 people: his operations director, his lead analyst, 2 junior associates who had been on the ground in Edmonton for the final 2 months. He did not say her name. Corinne picked up her water glass. She took a sip. Beside her, she heard Priya, who had come as Hartwell's communications lead, draw a very small breath. Brendan stepped back from the microphone. More applause. Then Graham leaned slightly forward and said, quietly, to the person on his left, the chair of the Lumiere committee, a man named Alistair Price who had known Graham Whitfield for 15 years. "I understand there's been a submission to the records committee about this project." Alistair looked at him. "There has. And?" Alistair folded his hands on the table. He had the manner of someone who found delicacy professionally useful, but not personally comfortable. "We'll be addressing it." Graham nodded once, as if this settled something. It had been Veronique's idea, in the end, though Corinne had supplied everything she needed. The Lumiere Awards had a records committee, a small, rarely invoked body that existed to ensure the integrity of the submission process. Corinne had not known this until Veronique mentioned it. At their meeting in late August, after Corinne had brought her every document she had. The original project proposal, dated and saved to her personal drive, from the night she drafted it at her kitchen table. The email chain with the Edmonton contacts she'd initiated. Going back 22 months, the zoning variance application that had her signature on it because she was the one who had filed it. The Hartwell due diligence report, completed after Graham's team had independently verified the project's structure, which had noted, in clean institutional language, that the expansion's architecture bore the hallmarks of a single strategic voice. She had submitted a formal record of contribution to the committee in September. Quietly, through the appropriate channels, without telling anyone except Veronique and, eventually, Graham. She had not done it for the award. The award was a plaque and a photograph and a moment on a stage. She had done it because she was tired of watching what she built carry someone else's name. The committee contacted Brendan's firm 2 weeks before the gala. She did not know what that conversation had looked like. She could imagine it. Brendan found her during the cocktail reception that followed the awards. She was standing near the windows with Graham and Alistair, and a woman from Meridian she'd worked with the previous spring, and she was in the middle of a sentence about the Gatineau Corridor project when she felt him approach. She finished her sentence first. Then she turned. Brendan Marsh looked like a man who had been having a very good evening until approximately 40 minutes ago. His tie was slightly loose. His smile, when he produced it, had the quality of something assembled quickly from available parts. "Corinne," he said, "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "I'm here most years," she said pleasantly. "This is Graham Whitfield, you may know each other, and Alistair Price from the Lumiere Committee." Brendan shook hands with both of them. His grip on Alistair's hand was slightly too firm, she noticed. The kind of grip that was meant to communicate something. "Congratulations on the award," she said. He looked at her. In his eyes was something complicated. Not guilt quite, because she wasn't sure guilt was in his particular register anymore. More like calculation. He was deciding what version of this moment to play. "Thank you," he said. "It was a significant project." "It was," she agreed. "I thought so when I designed it." The silence that followed was brief but total. Alistair Price cleared his throat. "The committee will be reaching out to your office next week, Mr. Marsh. There are some supplementary credits to be formally recognized. Standard process." Brendan looked at him, then back at Corinne. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for, something between comprehension and a kind of resigned fury, and she held his gaze and felt nothing that she hadn't already made her peace with. "Right," he said. "Of course." Tanya appeared at his elbow a few minutes later. She was pretty, with the particular energy of someone who had been told they were charming so many times that it had become both true and slightly exhausting. She looked at Corinne with the expression women sometimes have when they are meeting the person who came before them. A complicated mixture of assessment and relief, and something small and uncertain underneath both. "Tanya Fielding," she said, extending her hand. "Corinne Aldridge," Corinne said, and shook it. There was a pause. "I've heard a lot about you," Tanya said, and then seemed to realize immediately that this was the worst possible thing to say, and her expression flickered. Corinne smiled. "I hope some of it was accurate," she said, and left it at that. She turned back to the window and her conversation, and after a moment she heard Brendan and Tanya move away, and she exhaled very quietly through her nose. And Priya, who had appeared at her side at some point in the previous minute, pressed a fresh glass of wine into her hand without a word. The formal acknowledgement came 6 weeks later. The Lumiere Committee issued a supplementary citation recognizing Corinne Aldridge as the originating architect of the Edmonton Meridian Gateway project. It was posted on the committee's website and sent to the industry publications that covered this kind of thing. It was not a dramatic document. It was 3 paragraphs in clear, dry institutional language, and it said what she had done, and it had her name on it, and it was true. Veronique sent her a text when it went live. Just, "There it is." Corinne read it 3 times at her kitchen counter, with her coffee going cold beside her. The November light was the same as it had been a year ago. Gray, even, the particular flatness of a Montreal autumn. The plant she'd bought when she moved in was thriving, which she was unreasonably pleased about. The coffee maker had been descaled twice since she'd moved in. Small victories accumulate. Her phone buzzed again. "Graham. Meridian Corridor meeting confirmed for the 18th. Your proposal was the one they wanted." She typed back, "I'll have the updated framework to you by Friday." She set the phone down. She looked out the window at the gray November light, and she thought about the kitchen she'd left, and the backsplash tiles she'd picked, and the coffee maker dripping in the silence. after everything she had built had been quietly taken from her. Then she picked up her coffee, took a sip, it was cold, same as always, and went to her desk and opened her laptop and got to work. She had a proposal to finish, and this time her name was on it from the very first line.